Hey guys, just a quick intro on this video before we get started. In this video, we'll be measuring the piston to cylinder wall gap. So let's talk about why that measurement is important. So generally, when we talk about piston to cylinder wall clearance, this is the clearance between the piston and the cylinder wall at room temperature, obviously. But the reason this is critical is that as the engine warms up, the piston expands due to heat. Right? I think I've talked about that in some other videos. Again, the sort of fancy term is thermal expansion for that. But as the engine heats up, the piston can expand due to this heat. So having that gap there ensures enough room for the piston to move freely up and down the cylinder without seizing inside the cylinder. At the same time, we don't want the gap too large, because if it's too large, you'll end up with issues like reduced compression, because compression gases will tend to leak down past the cylinder. And also you can have a condition called cylinder or piston slap, where basically the piston's sort of banging around or moving inside the cylinder. In addition to a catastrophic event like the piston itself beginning to either crack or have issues, it can also cause excessive wear on the cylinder walls. The clearance also directly affects how efficiently the engine operates and how long it will last. So for instance, in a situation like mine where we're dealing with an older engine and worn parts, I've talked about this in other videos, knowing this piston to cylinder wall gap is also another data point for us to evaluate evaluate the engine build overall and where we may or may not be able to cut corners. So without further ado, here we go. We're going to use a feeler gauge to measure the clearance between the cylinder and the cylinder wall, or I'm sorry, between the piston and the cylinder wall. Again, these are keep in mind here, this is a piston from my donor engine. This is my numbers matching block, and then I've pulled these out of the 400 donor engine that I'm just going to swap the internals and swap the internals on. So we've got a worn engine block, different block. We've got pistons from a completely different engine, so it's worth spending some time looking at the clearance between the cylinder and the cylinder block. So let's I don't want this to fall down. One of the things you don't want it to do is fall down in there. Now again, there are no rings inside this, so that's why it's moving the way it is. Let's start out with a 4/1000, which is on the high end. I think Chrysler, the spec for the Mopar 400 is 1.5 to 2/1000 inches clearance between the piston and the piston wall. I have actually that's 2.5 I've already measured this, been taking some measurements, so I know it's all on the big side. So I'm gonna go with here's a 5/1000. Let's see what it does. So here's my feeler gauge. Now I've actually pulled this one feeler out of the gauge set. The gauge set comes sort of looks like that. The problem is I've bent these up over the years as I've used these. I sort of bend up the ends. I don't know if you can see that one right there. When I set valves on again motorcycles and other things, you often need a 90-degree turn in it. So most of these are bent. So actually what I'm doing here is I'm going to use, this one has a slight bend in it too. You see, yeah, right there you can see it has a slight bend, and I've tried to straighten it back out, but that's really going to affect the reading. The idea is here we're going to slide this down. In fact, let's go ahead and do it now. The other thing is when you take your measurement, the area up top where the rings are is actually a slightly smaller diameter. I don't know by how much, a few thousandths I'd say. So really, when you slide this feeler gauge down in here, you really need to be getting down into this skirt. This area is called the skirt. Obviously, you don't want to do it over here on the side. It really needs to be kind of around this area here. So let's slide it down in there. You know, you want to be careful here with your cylinder walls. Not to bang, not to let the rods sort of bang up against them too much. All right, and then I'm kind of supporting this on the back side so it doesn't slide and fall out the bottom. I've got the crank and everything else removed. So here it is. Keep in mind too, if you've got a ring ridge, lots of times worn engines will have a ring ridge. This one doesn't. It's been, I used a ball hone to sort of hone off. These were pretty rusty to start with. This block had been sitting. It had followed the car around, my 1972 Roadrunner. It had followed it around for about 20 years. So, but luckily, again, this is the numbers matching engine had stayed with the car, but it was a bare block. And so I don't think it had been stored outside or anything, but certainly these cylinder walls are super susceptible to rust. And so they just had, you know, light, pretty light surface rust. Anyway, let's go ahead and slide this feeler gauge down in here and see. So this, I like that. It's now you notice it slides down, but that's just past the ring area on top. As soon as it gets down to the, it gets down to the skirt, it stops. So that's a good thing. That's what I'm looking for. Again, this is 5/1000ths. You know, spec for these should be 1.5 to, let me pull this back out. Spec for these should be 1.5 to 2 thousandths. And I know it's going to be bigger than that, but let's get a smaller gauge. Let's go with 4 thousandths and see what we get. Alrighty, again, this one's kind of bent. The end of it's bent, so I'm just going to use the end. It's got the hole in it. So good there. It gets down to the skirt and then stops. I can slide a little bit in there and get it just in a little. I'm feeling it down here. It doesn't seem to want to go. Now you want to wiggle again in a case where you've got a worn engine. Again, we're not building a race engine here. Budget build, so we're going to be we're going to be using used parts that are going to be, we're pushing the envelope of what the factory specs are for what is considered serviceable. So yeah, I can just get that one down in there. So I'm guessing a 3 thousandths feeler is going to slide down in there, but let's see if, let's get one and see. 2 thousandths, 3 thousandths. Yeah, 3 thousandths. This one, I've actually just ordered a new feeler gauge set because this one's all broken and beat up here. Again, this is the same feeler gauge set I've had for probably 15 years, so I figured it was time for a new one. All right, so again, 3 thousandths. So this one, yeah, I can get it. See, I really have to sort of force it. Well, if I wiggle the piston around to fit, then I can slide that down in there. So I'm officially out of spec here. slide that in there. Yeah, I'm officially out of spec, but again, I'm going to make a educated, part of what we're trying to do here is make an educated decision about where we want to replace parts and how much rebuilding we want to do. Again, I'm not building a racing engine. The other thing is I'm going to have to drive this car, and once this engine is put in the car, I'm going to have to drive it in such a way knowing, knowing what kind of components I've put back in the car. So I'll just leave it at that. I say that to say, certainly in the first couple of 1,000 miles, I'm going to be very ginger with it. And then maybe as I'm more comfortable with the car and the engine and I feel like it's going to hold up, maybe I can push it more then. But again, we're going to make a bunch of educated decisions on based on the specs that we're getting here. Anyway, that is an example of feeler gauge, using a feeler gauge to test the clearance between our piston and cylinder wall.